Cool, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Thank you everybody for joining us tonight. And welcome to the Michigan Clean Water Action, My Water, My Future virtual town hall on climate change is water change. We'll be talking tonight about one of, if not the most critical issue of our time, the ongoing climate crisis. And our panelists tonight are three people who are really leading the way in pushing our federal and state governments to address climate with the sort of bold and aspirational plans that are necessary to ensure that we leave a livable planet for future generations. I'm sure it comes as no surprise to most of the folks joining us tonight that right now, neither our state or our country are taking the kind of bold steps that will be necessary to avoid the worst potential impacts of climate change. The good news is that in taking the necessary actions to respond to the climate crisis, we could be creating millions of good-paying jobs while also addressing the major environmental injustice and equity concerns that plague especially poor communities and communities of color here in Michigan and across the country. And before we jump into it here, I just did want to celebrate some good news that actually each of our panelists has played a role in this campaign as well. It was announced earlier today that Judge Jamo in the Ingham County Circuit Court granted Attorney General Nessel's request for a temporary restraining order against Enbridge Energy, and Line 5 will remain shut down in the Straits of Mackinac until the judge rules on a temporary injunction. On a preliminary injunction, rather. So really good news to celebrate tonight. I know Chairman Bryan Newland of the Bay Mills Band has been one of our critical leaders in this fight. And Michele Dietrich, wonderful Washtenaw County activist for a long time and member of the Democratic National Committee representing Michigan, has also played a big role in this fight, especially in getting some of our biggest national supporters on board. And of course, Representative Rashida Tlaib, who will be joining us momentarily, has been a leader in that fight as well. And these folks are all leaders on climate as well. So for now, we're gonna take a minute for each of our panelists to introduce themselves. And again, Representative Tlaib is running oh, there she is. Congresswoman Tlaib is just joining now. Welcome, Congresswoman.
Hi, how are you all? So sorry about that. I was trying to figure it out.
Hey, no worries. Thank you for joining very much.
Oh, thank you so much.
And I was just sharing the good news with everybody about the court ruling today for a temporary restraining order, and filling in on all of our panelists' role in that fight as well as climate. So now we're going to take a minute for each of our panelists to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about what got them involved in fighting climate change. And we're going to start with Chairman Bryan Newland, the chair of the Bay Mills Indian community and one of the leaders in the fight on the climate crisis in Michigan, as well as the fight to shut down Line 5. And Chairman Newland is also the recipient of our Clean Water Action 2020 Great Lakes Protectors Award, in recognition of his efforts and the efforts of Michigan's tribal leaders and communities in protecting our Great Lakes. So thank you for joining tonight, Chairman Newland.
Hey, Miigwech. Thank you, Sean, for having me here. As you mentioned, I'm the elected tribal chairperson for Bay Mills Indian Community. Way up here in the Eastern Upper Peninsula, where I'm sitting right now in my bedroom. I am about 2 miles from the Canadian border on the shores of Lake Superior. So we're pretty far up there, up here. One of the things that really, I kind of stumbled my way into the climate fight because so many things that are important to Indian people and Indian country deal with land and waters, because a lot of our cultural values are place-based cultural principles or religious principles. Our spirituality is not tied to a text like the Bible. It is often tied to places. And so often as I found myself involved in these Indian country efforts to protect places that are important to tribal cultures, was finding my way into these fights that related to climate change and the impact on changing ecosystems to a lot of our cultural practices and the exercise of our treaty rights. So I wouldn't, I'd be lying if I said I set out in my career to do this environmental work and get involved in climate change. I kind of found my way to it. But as I've been engaged in this over the years, it's become apparent to me how intertwined climate change is with everyday life, both for Indian people, but everybody around the world, because none of us will escape the impacts eventually.
Absolutely, and thank you very much for joining us, Chairman Newland. Next, we're going to go to a longtime Washtenaw County activist and member of the Democratic National Committee representing Michigan, and she's also the founder and chair of the Democratic National Committee Council on the Climate Crisis, Michele Dietrich. Thank you for joining us tonight, Michele.
Thank you so much for hosting this, Sean, and to Clean Water Action. It's great to be here with Bryan and Rashida and you. I think, like Bryan, I mean, I never intended to end up here. I was a policy analyst, and then I was a poet. And then I moved to Michigan actually to study poetry. And my husband and I bought a farm. And I can look out at the 80 acres right now, at the half of it, the 40 acres, which has produced no crop for 3 years because of 50% more precipitation. It's been flooded year after year. And seeing the effect on the land and in the sky really galvanized me to want to make some changes. And then we had oil companies coming through my township just east of Ann Arbor offering leases, because it turns out there's oil east of Ann Arbor. They used to pump it out in the 20s and 30s. It was a real wake-up call to me. And then we had the Nexus pipeline, so I got involved in fighting that, both as a citizen and then as a county commissioner, seeing how they were going to put the pipeline within 50 feet of homes. And guess what? The lowest income neighborhood in the entire county, of course, putting those houses in the incineration zone in the case of an accident. So I really haven't looked back from that. There's so much going on, and as I have so much privilege as a DNC member, and as now being able to found this council, I want to exercise every atom of that to fight for our children and our grandchildren, and for the people in the communities that are most and disproportionately impacted by this.
Great, thank you so much again for joining us tonight, Michele. And last, to introduce herself, we're glad tonight to be joined by one of the original co-sponsors of the Green New Deal resolution in Congress, and really one of the greatest forces for good in Washington, D.C., Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, Michigan's 13th District. Thank you again for joining us tonight, Congresswoman.
Well, thank you so much, Sean, and it's always good to see Michele again, and 2 days in a row. But yeah, I represent the 13th Congressional District in Michigan. Probably a 5-minute ride, Bryan, to Windsor. So pretty close to our Canadian neighbors. But I want to uplift the fact that I represent frontline communities that have experienced what doing nothing on environmental justice has felt. Sometimes we talk about water and air, but we don't realize, we sometimes are not doing a good job in humanizing what the impact is. So, I helped start We Have a Right to Breathe campaign when I was in the State House. That really led to pushing back on Marathon Oil, the Koch brothers dumping petroleum coke on the riverfront, to really asking folks to understand when you look at air permits or look at even water quality, that we have to look at public health as well. And so I grew up in Southwest Detroit. I always tell people I really did think that smell was normal. I thought some of these kind of issues regarding like where trucks were moving through our communities was normal. And so I am one of the few that say, shut it down. I don't want Line 5 to even be an option. That if we just centered all the decision on public health, I think to me is so interconnected to our environment, then people would absolutely 100% be with us in regards to that. And I think the majority of Michigan residents are with us. It's unfortunate, though, that people are being misled and gaslighted to believe otherwise, but that's why we're going to have to continue not only in the courts, not only through the legislature and through bills, but also really on the streets demanding that we have a right to breathe clean air and that we have clean water. And so I'm really so honored to be part of this movement in Michigan and to be working with so many incredible advocates and what I call my mama warriors in Southwest Detroit, who just continue to speak the truth about the injustice.
Excellent, thank you so much. And so for those of you watching on Zoom, we are going to have some time for audience questions tonight. So if you're watching on Zoom, please feel free to use the Q&A section at the bottom of your screens to enter questions. If you're watching on Facebook Live, enter your questions directly into the chat, and we're monitoring that as well. So our first question tonight is for Chairman Newland. And so Indigenous communities and leaders really across the world have been sounding the alarm on climate change and ecological devastation for a very long time. And so I wanted to ask about what potential climate impacts concern you the most, especially in relation to impacts on tribal traditions, communities, and treaty rights.
Thanks, Sean. All those things you just mentioned right there are interconnected, our culture, our way of life, and our treaty rights. We're all from the state of Michigan here. Michigan was admitted to the United States in 1837. A lot of people don't know that just 1 year before that, our tribes, our Ojibwe and Odawa tribes here in northern Michigan, ceded to the United States about half of the land that makes up the state now. And it's that treaty that actually allowed the state of Michigan to be admitted into the United States. And so as our ancestors were giving up everything, their homelands and being asked to confine themselves to reservations in northern Michigan, in spite of that, they explicitly reserved the right for our people to hunt and fish throughout the ceded lands, and that includes the Great Lakes. And that was intentional because that was central to our way of life. It always has been, and it continues to be to this day. And so anybody around the world who makes their lives around large bodies of water knows that fishing is you can go to any country and any culture, and if you live by the ocean or the sea or Lake Superior, fishing is going to be important to what you do. And, as we say around here, near Sault Ste. Marie, the whitefish used to be so abundant that you could walk across the St. Mary's Rapids on the backs of the whitefish. And that isn't true anymore. And whitefish has been critical to our ceremonies, our foods, our economies here, and they're becoming harder and harder to find because whitefish are very sensitive to the ecosystem in the Great Lakes. They need very cold waters, but they also need very still waters for spawning. And you might be asking or thinking to yourself, well, still waters and the Great Lakes don't really go together. Well, when we have ice cover, when the temperature is cold enough and the lakes freeze over, as they always have, the water beneath them becomes very still and becomes ideal for whitefish spawning. In those areas, along with invasive species, because of warming water temperatures, those areas for spawning are becoming rarer. The competition for food is becoming more intense, and whitefish, our traditional food source and our traditional economic lifeblood, are becoming harder to catch. And so we are actually in the midst right now of negotiations with the United States and the state of Michigan over how we're going to manage treaty fishing in the Great Lakes. And these are very important discussions in our community, in our tribal communities in northern Michigan, because they determine how we're going to manage this resource and how we're going to exercise our treaty rights. But because of the impact of climate change and leading to invasive species, both plants and other fish, we're fighting over dwindling resources, and it's actually making it harder to have intergovernmental relations with the state of Michigan and the federal government because the stakes are so high. So you know, here where I sit and in our tribal communities here in northern Michigan, our most acute impact right now is the changing Great Lakes ecosystem and what that means for who we are as Anishinaabe people. If there aren't any of our fish and our animal relations in the waters, we can't be who we're supposed to be as Anishinaabe people and live the way of life that we've lived for hundreds of years in this place.
Well, thank you very much for sharing that. I mean, it's one of the impacts of climate change that, you know, can't be discussed often enough is the environmental justice implications, you know, not only that people tend to think about in our cities, but on tribal reservations and in rural communities across the country as well. Next, we have a question for Congresswoman Tlaib. And as you've already mentioned, part of your congressional district contains the 48217 zip code, the most heavily polluted zip code in Michigan, one of the most heavily polluted zip codes in the country, which obviously has an effect on surrounding areas as pollution doesn't stop at the line of a zip code. What kind of perspective does that give you into the role that environmental justice has to play in addressing the climate crisis?
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the key, I think, recent events in our country with the pandemic is it showed its ugly face. The environmental racism that my residents are experiencing had showed its ugly face. I mean, majority of folks that died of COVID in Michigan were African Americans. And African Americans make less than 15% of the total population in Michigan. And so communities like 48217 was hit extremely hard with COVID, with the pandemic. And I really truly believe it's because of pre-existing conditions based on the pollution and the quality in the air. And I represent 12 communities in Wayne County. So from Romulus down to Inkster to Redford Township, Melvindale area, all of it, downriver. One of the key things that folks need to realize is for over a decade now, Wayne County, which is the largest, most populated, it's the most populated county in the state, hasn't met sulfur dioxide standards. And you know, the federal government literally says you're not in compliance on the Clean Air Act. So, you know, for so many of my residents in that community, it's a corporate assault on them. And, you know, it's so frustrating because one of the things is, you know, they just call me all the time and said, Rashida, yet again, I got up with a headache. Yet again, it smells like sulfur dioxide, like hydrogen sulfide outside. So many of them right now are really scared to hear so many of their neighbors, you know, getting cancer, respiratory issues. I have one of my seasoned residents who, you know, never had any issues, and all of a sudden now he has to be on a breathing machine before he goes to bed. I mean, there's just so much direct human impact on some of my families there. But it's really Wayne County communities in general. You look all corners, it is completely surrounded by pollution. And as we all know, it is now starting to impact, I believe all of it is starting to impact even our quality, our water. And it's hard, Sean, because we watched corporations actually take our taxes, like a tax abatement, in the same breath that they were taking it, they were offering jobs. And my residents were like, that's great, but jobs can't fix cancer. Stop telling us this is community development when, you know, we can't go outside for a barbecue because it just stinks so bad. Or when their houses are shaking because there's an explosion again at Marathon, or that the steel company, US Steel, continues to, you know, I think they're on their third consent agreement with the Department of Justice because they won't comply. I mean, AK Steel got caught over polluting like 725% over their air permit. So when my residents tell me, Rashida, oh, it's great, we got EPA and everything, but we feel like their departments, they should be renamed permission to pollute, because that's what they feel so much, that right now their public health, their quality of life is not at the center of a lot of decisions. So it's extremely painful. And, you know, one thing is that, and Sean, I've told you that my residents just want to feel believed. And Bryan, you know what I mean? Like, they just want to feel believed too, that the injustice that's actually happening to them is real. And when people come in to try to mislead folks that this is development somehow, they're like, development for who? Because it's not really development of their communities or their neighborhoods. And so we continue to speak the truth about what's happening. And again, it means not only shutting down line 5, I'll repeat that, but it's also saying enough. There's a different way and a different world that's possible. And that's what people want us. They want the Green New Deal. They want change.
Absolutely, thank you. And it's I really like that you highlighted the fact that this pandemic has really, I think, been a wake-up call, and hopefully will be a wake-up call for some people, that folks who have pre-existing conditions from environmental pollution and folks who have not been able to wash their hands at home because they don't have any running water in their houses, because we're in the richest country in the history of the world and we have people without running water at home, has really had an impact on who is being most affected by this pandemic. And one of the things we're going to get into tonight is, I think an important question for us all to look at is, why can't the United States lead the way on climate policy? What's stopping us? And to that point, I have a question for Michele. Michele, for a long time, official Democratic Party positions on climate change have frankly both been too weak to matter very much, and have also not been implemented by Democrats once they're in office. So can you talk about your work in founding the DNC Council on the Climate Crisis, and sort of what it took to even be able to get that, which you guys come out with a wonderful policy platform that we encourage people to check out. And can you talk about your work founding the Climate Crisis, why you decided to take a stronger approach than the party has in the past, and how you think this approach would hopefully yield better results than what we've had in the past?
Well, it better have a better result, because the climate clock is ticking. And if we don't act soon, as we all know, our planet and country and state are going to face devastating levels of damage and harm. And we're already in the midst of that. So when the DNC voted against a climate debate last summer, as you probably remember, which is something I and many others on the DNC, we're not a monolith. There are lots of us in there working for change, just not enough. A bunch of us had already been pushing DNC leadership for almost a year to establish the DNC's first ever Climate Council. There had been 3 prior attempts, and they had been squashed in various ways. But when the debate was voted down, it really created a political opening to enable us to do this. And in the end, the resolution passed with the help of a lot of organizations like Our Revolution and Sunrise and Sierra. I mean, people showed up for us, and it made a difference. So we were able to take that opportunity, get it passed, and DNC leadership actually supported this in the end. So, our goal is to help strengthen and develop Democratic Party policies and initiatives on climate, and make them bold, ambitious, transformative, and science-based, which is a big goal. But we have a couple of objectives that we think are moving us in the right direction. And I'm mostly going to talk about our work on policy in the Democratic Party platform. But I do want to mention these other things, because when the platform is over, our work isn't over, obviously. Even if the Democratic Party takes our 12-page document and adopts it word for word. So we are working to increase participation in the electoral process by people in the environmental and sustainability communities, and crucially, the people in the frontline communities who are impacted disproportionately, and too often whose voices go unheard or ignored, because in many cases they've been working on these issues for decades. So we want to work on candidate recruitment, helping people to understand how to run as environmental candidates. And then we're also already working with organizers to ensure that there are environmental caucuses or councils in Democratic state parties in every single state and territory, all 57. There are many states that don't have that. So we're already working with Maryland. They're on the verge of, I think, getting theirs passed. And then we want to network those so they have a unified, strong voice together within the Democratic Party. But right now we're really focused on the platform because it's being written this month and then adopted in mid-August at the nominating convention, which is sort of in Milwaukee. It's mostly going to be virtual. So why does it matter? And I have this question a lot. People are like, the platform. And I think the platform is a vision. It's a statement about where the party is, where it's going, what we can accomplish. It can help frame the narrative. We can help move the conversation as we did in 2016. I think it matters that in 2012, the Democratic Party platform at 40+ pages had half of a page on climate, environment, and energy. Also was pro-clean coal. So we come a little ways from then. 2016, we had 3 out of 40+ pages. Climate touches everything. Everything touches climate. We need a climate and environmental justice perspective to infuse our entire platform going forward. So we want to walk our walk as a council, as the Climate Council, and so not just talk. So we started off developing our platform recommendations with a 3-month process, which started with a listening tour across the United States. And we met with people who, from California to South Carolina, from Nevada to New Hampshire, and lots of places in between, youth, faith leaders, union members, environmental justice activists and scientists, and so on. And we made sure that our leadership and our policymaking framework are intentionally inclusive and diverse. So the council's leadership has a youth director, directors of Latinx, Indigenous, Black, and Asian American engagement. And then our appointed platform committee, on which Bryan actually serves. So thank you, Bryan, for that service. It was, his contributions were really invaluable, is also intentionally diverse and inclusive. And our policy is stronger as a result. So everywhere we went, what people said was, we need the Democratic Party to be the party of climate solutions. We did not get any pushback. People were pushing us to go harder, to go more ambitiously. They wanted to make sure that local conditions and impacts of climate were incorporated into the platform. And indeed, a lot of our best ideas came from these meetings with people learning about how mining impacts indigenous communities in Nevada when the mining companies leave their abandoned mines. So a couple of highlights from the 12-page document. We wanted the Democratic Party and our legislators to commit to near zero emissions by 2040. Net zero by 2050 is what you hear a lot. It's not good enough. The science is clear. Encouragingly, Vice President Biden has committed to a significant climate target by the end of his first term. He hasn't said what it is. So we proposed one for him, 100% carbon-free new building infrastructure. It's eminently doable, and it would make a huge difference. An end to fracking and all fossil fuel production as rapidly as possible, a just transition for displaced workers, and those workers who are impacted by the climate crisis. Apropos of what you were talking about earlier, Sean, we see clean air, water, and soil as fundamental human rights, and we want a ban on water shutoffs and guaranteed access to clean water. So why is it different this time? Because that was part of your question. Why do we have hope? I think the tragedy of the pandemic creates a crucial opening for us. With tens of millions out of work, with the fossil fuel industry in free fall, especially the fracking industry, which has never been profitable, there's a chance we're going to have to rebuild the economy anyway, right? So let's rebuild it sustainably. So these are not normal times. The platform is more important than ever, and we're going to fight tooth and nail to make sure it's as bold, transformative as possible.
Awesome, thank you very much. And I know Congresswoman Tlaib is going to have to take off in just a minute here to make it to a vote. But I did want to ask real quickly, this is a question for everybody, but we'll start with Congresswoman Tlaib. What role does money in politics play in our seeming inability to implement appropriate climate policy?
Yeah, I mean, I always talk about this, but all the broken systems, including what's going on with our environment, people are making profit off of our pain and suffering and the illnesses and sickness. I mean, everything that is happening to us is because folks have decided, I rather make money, and again, that has resulted in putting profits before people's health, before our environment. I mean, you know, if you just look at what happened to Flint, people don't fully understand that it wasn't some fluke. It was because somebody that was thinking only about money and spreadsheets and not based on public health, what's best for the people. And that's exactly what happened. As an emergency manager decided, not an elected, but an emergency appointed manager was elected or was appointed there to basically decide that it was okay. And then, you know, again, Bryan knows, I mean, my experience has been, people have been talking about the Flint water way before it became national, like something's wrong with the water. I hear all the time my residents say something's wrong with the air. And so if you look at the record profits of Marathon, the Steel Corp, I mean, all of them have profited off of more toxins and more pollution out there. And that's exactly what's going to continue happening. And we all know this. You know, I don't take any corporate PAC money, but out of 435 members of the House of Representatives, I think there's about only 60 of us, but the majority of my colleagues do. And no matter how much people will say, well, that doesn't mean anything. Yeah, it does. You're taking money off of the people that are hurting your people. And that is resulting in hesitation to be this aggressive around air and water in the environment and our public health. So I absolutely believe it's tainted our process. I mean, government is supposed to be about people. And like my resident said, it's not supposed to be a permission to pollute or permission to profit off of their pain. And before I go, Sean, just thank you so much, Michele, for uplifting a water shutoff moratorium. You know, in the last COVID response relief bill, we got $1.5 billion in Water as a Human Right Fund that I worked with Congresswoman Debbie Dingell on. And so Congresswoman Dingell and I were able to get it through. It passed in the House, it's sitting in the Senate, but this would be transformative for so many folks. So in there would not only have a moratorium on shutoffs, but it also requires reconnection and then direct help to families that need it. And people don't realize, so many of my families, it's not even just washing their hands. We had a mother once, somebody found she was going door to door just to get a little bit of milk to put the formula together. And then a two elderly couple, a couple that have been together for years, would literally take the snow and put it in a bucket and let it melt so they can use it to flush their toilet and everything. I mean, understand that water is life. And so we need to be moving in the direction. 1.5 billion seems a lot, but when there's 15 million Americans right now facing water shutoffs, it's very minimum. So we have to increase that fund and continue to invest in it. But thank you for uplifting that. And I'm really sorry I have to go. So we're voting on justice and policing, which is one step closer to some sort of accountability. I just hope we do something on poverty and environmental racism and healthcare and all the other things that are very much systematically racist. So we're going to work on that. But thank you all so much. I really appreciate this, and continue the work. Transformative change doesn't happen in the halls of Congress nor in the White House. It happens in the streets with all of you. So thank you all so much.
Thank you very much for joining us tonight,
Thank you.
Congresswoman.
Thank you.
And cool is yeah. So does anybody else want to react to that? Just about the role that money in politics plays from your perspective, either Michele or Bryan.
I'd be happy to jump in on that. Yeah, I think that the Congresswoman talked about the impact on electeds and candidates. It also has an impact on the party. And so, you know, the DNC has attempted a couple times to stop accepting fossil fuel money. And we actually passed a resolution and then it got rescinded. And the platform recommendations we have actually call for party organizations not to accept any fossil fuel money. Those companies do not give money without a reason, and the $400 billion a year in fossil fuel subsidies, which props up this industry, which should be the industry of the past, you know, I don't want to draw a one-to-one relationship, but there is clearly a relationship, and it needs to end.
And I would add, Sean, to just, I guess, coming from the, the Congresswoman talking about candidates and Michele talking about the impact on the party. And Michele, I do appreciate the work that you've done to advocate on these issues with the party as well. Just down here at the community level, it is, we can't compete. If the competition is around dollars, we can't compete. The people up here in northern Michigan don't support having a foreign-owned pipeline taking foreign gas out of the country and using our waters as a shortcut. But that majority rule principle gets overridden time and again simply because somebody can make campaign contributions orders of magnitude larger than any of us could, or all of us could combined. And so what it does is it puts us in a position as people on the ground in our communities to expend an extraordinary amount of energy just to move the ball down the field an inch. And that isn't how a democratic form of government is supposed to operate. And anybody with two eyes and two ears and space between them sees the influence of money in our political system, and they know it's broken.
Absolutely, and thank you both for highlighting that. Money in politics is such a critical issue, and we've seen all the combined money of everything that Michigan tribal governments, environmental nonprofits, and several others can throw together is nothing to equal the money that one oil company can spend to influence things, as we kind of saw in Lansing yesterday. So another question that we have for Chairman Newland, what can we learn from the activism that Native communities across the country have been doing for centuries against pipelines and to protect water and the planet?
Actually, I think if there's anything to take away, it's a value that Michele has already touched on in her comments about why she fights climate change or is engaged in this fight. Because when you look at Standing Rock, for example, with the Dakota Access Pipeline, and people getting shot with water cannons and freezing temperatures, they are not only there for themselves. They are there for the people who are coming after. And in our own cultural values here in Michigan with the Anishinaabe people, and myself as a leader for our tribe, we are compelled by our values to consider how our actions today impact the people who come after us for 7 generations. Now, that 7 generations that's 100 years. And so you've really got to think long term. And so if somebody is wondering, what can people take away from tribal activism, I think the most important principle is to think intergenerationally, because that's, a lot of these problems are not going to get solved to completion in our lifetime and even in my kids' lifetimes. But that doesn't mean that you should simply give up and get yours. What it means is that you got to change your framework for your thinking and think intergenerationally. And I think that's the biggest lesson I hope people would draw from what tribes do when we engage on these issues.
Great, thank you very much. Such an important perspective. So another question that we have in here, so what, in your opinions, are some of the climate impacts that you expect we're going to encounter in Michigan? We already know that, as Chairman Newland identified, the lack of freezing in the Great Lakes causing that, among other things, causing a dip in whitefish populations and other fish species we've already seen non-indigenous plants and animals coming over, and in the case of zebra and quagga mussels and others wreaking havoc in the Great Lakes. But what are some climate impacts that maybe we haven't quite seen yet that you expect we might encounter in Michigan and the Great Lakes region specifically? What are some of the important things in this part of the country for us to be preparing for?
So I think it's going to impact everything. It's going to, something people don't think about a lot is just the costs involved in rebuilding from damage. Hardening our infrastructure, it's called, against the impacts of extreme weather events. It's going to have an impact on food production. It already is, as I mentioned on my own farm, but things are getting more and more variable. So I talked about not having crops because of too much rain, but you can literally go the other side of my township and they didn't have enough rain in 2 of those years because it's just so spotty. I think one thing that may happen to Michigan, if the models are correct, is we may see a lot of climate immigration from the rest of the US because this will be one of the more livable places. And so we'll be fighting climate gentrification and all the issues involved in having people come here to a state that right now we'd like to have, a little bit more growth maybe in population, but that will have a lot of implications for people, especially given that I think what in part happens is that all of the things that are already problematic in the state, our incredible crumbling infrastructure, the devastation of our education system from underfunding, all of these things will be stressed more and more with this added layer put on top, kind of like the pandemic has done.
Sure, and Sean, again, I live up here in the woods, and Michele, you talked about the changes in agriculture. The changes to our forests and our ecosystems here. Forest fires are very rare in Michigan. They're big forest fires because we live in the middle of the largest freshwater system in the world, and as we get hotter here, the normal plant life that we see in our forests is going to change and become more susceptible to forest fires, and that's going to jeopardize communities who live near the forests. It's going to change the types of animals we see that live here in Michigan, and for us as tribal people, because our way of life is connected to where we live and what's around us. If those things change, we change, and it's another way that, or it's another avenue for our way of life to be taken away from us. And so, that's something that's concerning to me as a tribal leader. But we're going to see a lot more changes to the places that we love here in northern Michigan, just because it's the seasons and the temperature and the water levels have shaped this place for so long, and if it changes rapidly, it's going to look dramatically different. And a lot of the places people like to visit from downstate aren't going to exist anymore.
Great, yeah, thank you both. And so here's a question that we hear quite frequently, largely due to Enbridge Energy's spending of millions of dollars influencing public opinion in Michigan, which, by the way, before I just did want to share one other thing with people. So the reports that Enbridge provided about their most recent damage to the Line 5 pipeline to the state of Michigan was just made public earlier today. And Enbridge's engineers provided pictures taken of monitors with a picture of the pipeline on the monitor and the damage. So the engineers working for Enbridge literally just could not figure out or be bothered to figure out copy and paste for a state report, yet somehow they have millions of dollars to spend buying votes and influencing public opinion in Michigan. And because they influence public opinion, we have a question here about an article implied that northern Michigan and or the UP received some of the product going through the Line 5 pipeline. Is this true? And so I'd give that to Bryan, I guess, to start with.
Sure. I love taking this question, Sean, because I get asked this question all the time when I'm talking to folks about Enbridge. Enbridge would have the public believe that if this pipeline went away, that those of us who live up here in the Upper Peninsula would revert to a state of primitive cave dwelling. We would be lighting our furniture on fire to keep ourselves warm in the wintertime, and you know, it's going to be 2000 BC all over again. That's just simply not true. Up here in northern Michigan, like a lot of other places, the larger towns and the areas around them get their winter heat through natural gas. That's what my home is heated with, and that's not to diminish the reliance on propane that other folks receive when they live farther out in the woods. I will add too that I'm going to break out my hand map, Sean, because I think this is important. You know, so we got the state of Michigan. I'll do it this way, and the pipeline comes all the way across the Upper Peninsula, and then all the way over here to the thumb. And there is a little spot over here called Rapid River, where there's they take a little bit of propane out of the pipeline, and that propane gets delivered to markets around the UP. And then for over 100 miles, everything else in that pipeline travels to the Straits and down and onto the thumb. And somehow Enbridge has managed to convince people that if they can't carry oil through the Straits, that they can get propane to that spot over 100 miles west of the Straits. It's never made sense to me. I'm not an engineer. I'm only a lawyer, so maybe I'm just not getting it. But you know, there is some propane that comes to the UP in Line 5. It's offloaded hundreds of miles, over 100 miles west of the Mackinac Straits, and we are not heavily dependent on that propane here in the Upper Peninsula, such that you know, we will be taken back centuries in our civilization if it goes away.
Thank you very much for that answer, and I'm sure we're all relieved to hear that you won't revert to living in a cave if the Attorney General is successful here with her lawsuits to end this big threat to the Great Lakes. So we have a question here for Michele as well regarding the US Congress. Is it just a matter of flipping the Senate to get the attention to environmental justice and climate change that's needed? Or can we make progress if and when Joe Biden is elected, presumably, and even get a couple of seats closer in the Senate? It's dismaying that we're losing time on this issue.
So the good news is that if we win the presidency, even if we can't flip the Senate, and I am hopeful about the Senate, but there's a lot that a president can do. And we've seen the flip side of that with Trump. He's rolled back almost 100 different environmental regulations simply through executive action. So, you know, President Biden can reverse all those, and in many cases can do a lot of things that will improve on things. I mean, there's things like simply putting in place the structures, a just transition task force. We propose in our recommendations that he would create an executive committee that would create a national climate action mobilization plan so that we can start implementing it 6 months out. So, and there are many things like that that he could do that would make a big difference. There's something called the Climate Action President Plan, which enumerates many of them. It's been vetted by lawyers, which is a good thing. And so we know we can make progress. So that is part of why it's so important that we have impact on the platform and on the vice president's plans for his presidency, so that when he goes into office, he is ready to move into action, whatever he's faced with in Congress. Great question, but there's hope there.
Yeah, thank you very much. Great answer as well. I mean, that definitely we've seen how Trump has been able to roll things back, and a movement pressuring a president should be able to move things in the other direction. So we have a couple other questions.
Sean, can I just jump in on that very
Absolutely.
briefly? You know, one of the unfortunate things with politics is it is so easy to stop progress and to wreck it, and it doesn't actually require a high level of competence and governance at all. And the effort to just get back to where we were 4 years ago in terms of policy is going to take a monumental effort. And I think it's going to be important that folks have an understanding that destruction of good policy goes much faster than construction of positive policy. But it's important to push and keep that pressure on.
Absolutely, thank you. And I'd also just like to flag for folks listening, it's almost impossible for the Democrats to flip the U.S. Senate if Gary Peters loses his race here in Michigan. And Clean Water Action has been proud to endorse Senator Peters, who really has done a lot of the information we have on Line 5 and some of the other critical water issues. We would not have publicly without the work of Senator Peters. So important that we remember that here in Michigan. So we have time for one final question. And I'd just like to ask, for each of you, what keeps you going in this movement? What keeps you leading the fight for climate change?
That's actually a hard question to answer sometimes, Sean, because this pandemic, frankly, has been very taxing. And some days you get out of bed and you say, "Why am I doing this to myself?" I think for me, it's that responsibility. We're a small tribe. At Bay Mills, we have 2,200 tribal members, and we all, we're a handful of families, and we all grow up together. We all know each other. So being elected as tribal chairperson is not, it's not like being elected governor, right? You are being entrusted by your family to carry out some responsibilities. And so for me, when I'm taxed to the max and tired, and stressed out, the thing that keeps me going is just knowing that the people I grew up with, my family, people who helped raise me, and then their kids and the people who are going to come after us, entrusted me to do this. And I can't hide in a governor's mansion or a White House or anything like that. I mean, it doesn't work like that in Indian country. I gotta see everybody every day. We all know each other. And so you can't go out and look people in the eye if you're not going to meet the responsibility of fulfilling that trust. And so, when your auntie says, "Where were you? Why weren't you there?" you better have a good answer. So that's what keeps me going.
Thank you. Great answer. Appreciate your work. And Michele.
Yeah, you noticed my eagerness to let Bryan go first, because it was surprisingly hard. And people, I'm sure you know this too, Sean, that people who work on these issues, and many people watching know this, there's something called climate fatigue. It's always present. There's always that sense of responsibility and knowing that things are not going well. And then we layer on top of that the pandemic and the issues of white supremacy and police brutality. It can be difficult. And I think for me, it's remembering, and sometimes I have to make myself remember, but remembering the joy and the beauty that does exist. When you look out at the trees and the birds and at the younger people who are working on these issues and who deserve to have a great future. And so it probably comes back in the end to a sense of responsibility, but remembering there can be joy in all of this too. And also I get to meet really awesome people doing this work, and they inspire me, people like you and Bryan. And Rashida, she's not here, but her too.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Michele and Bryan, and thank you as well to Congresswoman Tlaib and to all of you listening in who joined us to hear about this. And I also like to thank our technical team for tonight, from Clean Water Action, Jen Schlicht, our communications manager, and Meredith Gillies, our Southeast Michigan program organizer. So thanks to everybody for joining us. We all know that we need to act on climate, and we need to do it now. But one thing, I think that we all know is true is it's going to take millions of people standing up across the country and across the world to create the change that we need and to take back the power from the oil industry and the corporations who don't really care if we address climate or not, as long as their profits keep flowing. So thank you all for standing with us, and thank you to our excellent panelists. Please join us for our next virtual town hall coming up on Thursday, July 16th at 7 p.m., where we're going to be discussing Michigan's water infrastructure and what we need to do to update the critical infrastructure that we rely on to protect our water and public health. So thank you all again, and just want to give a quick shout out here. Michele just shared a link to sign the Climate Council's petition and endorse the DNC Climate Council proposals that we know we need to be in place to push the Democratic Party in the correct direction so that we can actually address climate as a country. So thanks for sharing that, Michele, and thanks again to all of our panelists and everybody joining. Have a great evening.
Thank you so much. Good night.
Good to see you, Michele. Take care.
See you, Bryan. Good to see you, Sean. Take care.
Good to see you.
Bye, Sean.